So, welcome everybody to the most recent round of the evening program of our exhibition In Search of Europe, Equals in an Unequal World. I'm very happy to welcome you here today. We have a second evening in 2 days around the theme of migration. That was one of the themes that originally motivated us to create this entire project. And today's topic is called The Invisible or the Visible Migrant, Visual Representation of African Migration in Art, Film and Photography. And we have two guests today, each of whom will be giving a very interesting presentation from their own work, some up to 30 minutes length, and there will be also sufficient time for discussion between and after the presentations. Now I would just like to introduce you to the people who are speaking today. I myself, I'm Samuli Schielke. I'm the academic head of the project. I'm an anthropologist working on a lot of different topics in Egypt. And Daniela Swarowsky, who is here with me, is the curator of the In Search of Europe exhibition, and she has also worked in a number of collaborative projects that have migration as their topic. So migration is also one of the core themes of her own work, both during this exhibition as well as before it. I'm very happy to welcome two persons who are on behalf of guests. Aïssatou Mbodj, who is actually one of the members of our In Search of Europe research project from the beginning on. She's currently a research fellow at the CNRS in Paris, affiliated with the Centre d'études du monde africain, CEMA. But she has also been working constantly along with our project and was also for 1 year a research fellow here in Berlin. And her research has been mainly on the anthropology of literacy through ethnographic work mainly in Mali, on writing practices in various settings. And out of this long-standing field also grew her current research that she's doing in the In Search of Europe project about the African migrants' housing in Paris called Foyers, which she interrogates also in regard to the history and the contestations of memory, use, and the question of where is one when one lives in a foyer. Our other speaker who will come speaking after Aïssatou is Dominique Malaquais, with whom we also have been already discussing this project before it even started. She is a senior researcher also at the Centre d'études du monde africain at the CNRS in Paris. She's also director, together with the educator and activist Daniela Diallo, of SPARC, or which is an abbreviation of Space for Pan-African Research, Creation and Knowledge, which is an experimental curatorial platform based in South Africa. Her work, which brings anthropological academic research in a wonderfully interesting way together with artistic curatorial work, focuses on intersections between political and economic violence and contemporary Arabian cultures in the post-colony. And I would like to ask Aïssatou to come here as the first speaker and just give us a second to set her presentation so that it's visible. And thank you very much and welcome, and I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I'm very sorry. I lost my concept because actually Daniela, I'm sorry, Aïssatou, because I went over to introducing the speakers, so I jumped over Daniela, who also will give you a very short introduction into how we came here, because this issue of the visual representation of migration has been going along with our project for a long while. Sorry, Daniela.
Well, I'm not going to talk long, but I would like to give you a very short introduction of how this whole topic of the migrant, visible, invisible, the visible, invisible migrant came into existence. So I have been collaborating with Aïssatou in June 2011, where we started to think about who could be an interesting interesting artist to work collaboratively with her. So in doing research on what has been done on the foyers from a photographic, artistic point of view, I also did larger research into all kinds of projects, artistic projects, photographic projects, mostly around migration. And in looking at many works which were at that time available, I sort of asked myself how much this work, which I was focusing mostly on French artists, is already a sort of genre, this kind of genre of working around migration and how to depict migration. So this visual representation and how artists or photographers, documentary photography, but also artistic photography deals and tackles migration was something which started to interest me a lot, and where also in the interviews with the artists I was very interested in how they approach the migrants and how they sort of conceptualize their work. So over the course of the years we also formulated a journée d'études in Paris, in Chiasma, where we made a 1.5-day symposium around the topic, where we tried to invite different people to talk about the issue, and where we showed also the work of Vincent Leroux, which you can see here, and Anissa Michalon, who has been the collaborator of Aïssatou over the past 3 years. So I hope that we have a chance for a very vivid debate, and also I hope that the audience brings in their own experiences and views. And yeah, so I give the word now to Aïssatou.
Thank you very much. This is not a lecture as such, but more a presentation. I work as an anthropologist, and I've been doing research through mainly ethnography and also archival work. So my research topic is not visual representation as such, but when we decided that I would collaborate with a photographer within the foyer, so I will say a word of those residencies for migrants in Paris. I found it important to have a look at all the images surrounding the foyer. So this presentation is intends to unpack this idea that I propose of the foyer as iconic places, and especially for an audience who might not be familiar with those places and the way they are represented. So my first point is to highlight that the simple difficulty of getting there as journalist, researcher, or artist. So before I present images, I will say a few words on access to the foyer, and begin by a story about the foyer, which is the topic of Vincent Leroux's series over there. So he has worked on an old foyer while it was rebuilt. And in the 1980s, a journalist crew, guided by an anthropologist, Jacques Leroux, decided to make a film on different communities, migrant communities in France. So they turned to the foyer as an easy starting point, and they dealt with the local authorities within the foyer, the community leaders, who, and they pointed to an intermediary to work as their guide. It was a griot, so it's in West African society, kind of bands, but they also act as brokers, and to be their guide. But then other elected representatives of the community who were younger, objected and say that they didn't want him to provide a traditional view of the foyer, but they wanted to bring in their struggles, the struggles of the time, the political issue around their housing condition. So in the end, he couldn't film in the foyer. They had to visit some families around them. So this anecdote for me is interesting because there are also many images we just don't have about the foyer, and even if all the images I will show are taken from by outsiders, we still need to think a lot about how they were controlled when they came in and how they had to negotiate access. So I turn now to this iconic status of the foyer as part of the visual and discursive representations of African migrants in French cities. I will frame this part around three features or motifs of the resident of the foyer and the kind of visual representation they are associated with. I have to say that I will try to give a sense for each of these figures of its historical depth, though obviously in this short talk I will not be able to provide a deep contextualization. But just to give an overview, the foyers were built from the 1950s onwards by different associations, and some really controlled by the French state, some less controlled by the French state. And there are both places of controlled containment of immigration and also places where the communities could organize themselves. And once they were really the dominant mode of housing for immigrants from Africa, and especially from migrants from the Senegal River region. But now they only account for around 10% of the housing of this community. So numerically they are marginal, but they still retain a certain centrality for newcomers, for social events in some of the communities. So that's just some background information. So the first recurring idea, both in discourses, but which is also strongly visualized, is the idea of the foyer as an African village. And especially, for instance, for the Malian community, if journalists want to know what the Malian community has to say on any topic, maybe war in Mali or anything, they would go to Foyer Barra in Montreuil in that case. So often this will go with a tour of own foyer where you see several scenes, typical scenes. So I begin with a newspaper article, press article in Le Monde, dating back from 1996. So Foyer Barra, a village for Malians in Montreuil, and I just read the first line. It's as well known in Bamako as the Tour Eiffel, and it reproduces the traditional structures of the country. End of quote. Interestingly, this piece is also appears on website from Schielke, a community website. So it's not seen as something that is depreciated. It's also taken back. And I point to this double, this kind of mirror where you have the idea that the foyer is an African village in Paris, but that for the community it functions as Paris. And this is really something that is recurring. So I just found a blog post by Russian who made a reportage. And so you have the same quote. Foyer Bara is the same symbol of Paris. And he, in his blog post, there are other images, and he said that he was lucky enough to see a tailor shop, and he said that his guide was really someone who could give him access to things that very few people have seen, but unfortunately he couldn't take photographs. He was permitted to take photographs. Actually, the workshop is one of the most photographed place in this foyer. So this is a more artistic series from Hélène Jaillet, and you, in her series, Au cœur du foyer, so you go in the heart of the foyer, which is, you also have the blacksmith, a typical scene of an African village, but then shown here. So those are really recurring images. So the second motif, if you would, is a miserabilist view on the foyer as offering poor lodging conditions for people, and with different angles. Sometimes it can be really politically engaged on denunciation, and sometimes you have very so this is very typical scene, image. I chose it for that. Unfortunately, I couldn't get back to the archive and get the date, but yeah, it looks like the 60s or 70s. Yeah. But then you have something more clinical on poor, the decaying state of the building. So sorry, I didn't translate it, but there are two press reportages very recently on this foyer, un foyer pourri. And so this is the kind of images you get, which are, I think, speak for themselves and are shown also with a view of shocking people and getting them to react and, yeah, denouncing the condition. Finally, during the 70s, the foyers were sites of struggle, and much of the struggle of black immigrants focused on either the workplace, obviously, and they were with other workers, or on the foyer themselves. And there was a very long strike when they refused to pay the rent of the foyer. And at that time, it was really a politicization of this figure of the African migrant and black African migrants, along with migrants from North Africa. But for black Africans, it was one of the instances of their public appearance. I rely also on the work by Jean-Philippe Dedieu, a colleague, sociologist and historian. So that you have those kind of images, and in the exhibition I really wanted to display those images, so you have a book where you have some archival material over there, because I think it's a strong moment in the history of the foyers, but also part of the way they are depicted. So this is very recent press photographs. There are ongoing and low-key struggles, but you still have the same slogans and images of standing men claiming rights. And this I would align with it. This was from a post where you had a representative voicing some of their concerns. So now I turn to two pieces that before working with Anissa Michalon, the photographer, we also looked at a few artistic projects in the foyer. That there are actually many artistic projects. In a way, there are places that are an easy starting point for a researcher, artist. Yeah, so there you have to get access to. They are not very simple places to work in, but it's easy because you have the community there. And I think it's important as a researcher, as well as an artist, and Anissa Michalon, to question also this setting. And I will say a few more on it. So, but I just wanted to say that there are many, many projects on the foyer. I will circulate a little book by Olivier Basquiat. I think the artistic projects that are developed around the foyer very much respond to the images that I've shown before, or work with some of them. And countering a miserabilist view of the foyer, you have this project which is explicit in its title, Merci aux travailleurs venus de loin, so thank you to the workers came from afar. And where it is black and white photography, so a very an emphasis on dignity, with also small excerpts of interviews. And it's individual photographs, so maybe in the discussion we can come back more to this issue of dignity, which is a very clear angle, but I will show also it can be a bit slippery in my idea of what is going on now. The second project was a studio photo, reminiscent of the genre of the West African studio photograph, which was set in a kitchen of a foyer. So interestingly, the background, you still have the kitchen and the ordinary setting, plus this decor, which was chosen. So this idea of aestheticizing the foyer was something Anissa Michalon, the photographer I worked with, also had very strongly in mind. And she came from the Beaux-Arts, and she was very, when we worked together, she was really looking for the beautiful photography. So one of the photography you can see over there in the series, the one on the second row on the left, that also feature as a background of the first slide. This was taken in a room with a delegate, a representative, who introduced us there and said, okay, you can take my room, it's a museum. And she actually spent some time to find good light and to have this kind of something looking like a painting. That's what she had in mind. So I will switch this and come now to the present condition of the foyer. So, since there was a debate in the late 1990s about destroying the foyer, there was a whole debate on these places as communitarist place, as we put it in French, and so there were several options. One would have been to destroy the foyer altogether. It's a very French institution with its colonial, post-colonial history, and to switch that to just normal residents. The foyer are only, you only find men living there, so it was very much in the idea of men coming for a short time and going back, but of course when migration was contained and they couldn't circulate that much. Some of them brought their family, but still some decided to work in France without having their family coming, or they didn't meet the requirements for that. So you still have single men or married men with their spouses and children back home in their country where they come from. So you still have this kind of population, but it was unclear if this kind of dedicated residence should be kept or not. But in the end, there was really the idea of keeping this format, and but rebuilding old buildings and also operating a selection within the residents for who should stay and who shouldn't. So in Paris, it's approximately since the mid-2000s and it's really implemented. And it's a context of ongoing struggles and discussions within the foyer with the community leaders and other members. So it's not struggles as visible as in the 70s, but it's a kind of ongoing confrontation. Vincent Leroux worked in this context on a rebuilding project. His work is he comes from a background as an artist, and his topic was space and not migration, so he was interested in that dimension of the process. But he also had trouble getting access to the community leaders and occasion to take part in collective moments. So his work is a series of individual portraits, and it's people he met while he was there. He really spent years following the project, and with a short extract of interviews. So I think his work is very interesting and successful. It tells something about the project of the rehabilitation of the foyers, because they opt for single rooms and they actually have very few collective spaces. And actually, foyer Commanderie, which is located in the northeast of Paris, in the 19th district, was one of the first and a bit controversial because they actually have very few collective spaces. So now it's a kind of counter-model. Even the institution said, no, we will not redo the Commanderie. So, but there was a debate after he published his book that will circulate, because activist photographer said that he was really doing what the institution, promoting the work of the institution. And so I think it can be read in different manners. We can say that he is showing what's going on, in a way, or, but sure he didn't try to also offer a counterpoint and found collective moments. I mean, he couldn't, because of the way he accessed the foyer. So, yeah, I think he's, I mean, we brought him in because we liked his work, but I think it really raises some discussion. I think it goes as far as linking to a wider issue of what kind of social processes are at stake and what kind of vision of what should be an immigrant now is at stake. But what he doesn't show much is how much this is negotiated with the residents themselves. So finally, I will jump to this series. It's again in the 19th district of Paris, dans le 19e arrondissement, rue Loutte-Poule, and it's a foyer who was built in 1979 from an older foyer located elsewhere in Paris. And I have been following the residents for a while, and so they came in the process of rehabilitation more recently. The foyer now is supposed to be destroyed next March. So we introduced our work as a work on a memory, un travail de mémoire, memory work, sorry. But it was taken up by different residents differently. So the series of photos and the choice of photograph were done with the residents themselves. So I mentioned the one which was, the museum that we had to take. We really wanted to show the outside of the foyer, not to stay inside. residents staged themselves, and I would like to point to the photograph down about men praying. The issue of prayer rooms in the foyer is a very hot political issue. They are not supposed to be prayer rooms. So when each time you have a debate about a new foyer, you have the residents saying, okay, we want a large prayer rooms, and you have people of the institution replying, okay, we can't offer you prayer rooms, we are not allowed by French law to fund religious spaces, but you will have a multifunctional space and you do whatever you want with it. But then they locate the multifunctional space at, in places in the foyer where circulation from the outside is not easy, because they don't want this space to become the prayer space for the whole neighborhood, which is often the case because of lack of such spaces in Paris. So there is a whole debate, political issue around the prayers, but and so we didn't intend to photograph men praying, but then we were led by a guy who said, no, that's a photograph you should take. We did. And when we came back with the photograph, he was not there, so we handed it to someone else. We never saw him praying. So I think it also says something about the way people actually use us also. But in the end, it's good to have this in this series that is more documentary, because it's actually one of the important spaces in the film. So, yeah, I would, maybe I think I can leave more space for the discussion, but what I would like to point out, and it's here in the two work, is that sometimes we are working very much with this idea of dignity, and where I found that it's a bit problematic is that the institutions themselves always insist on, we want to provide decent housing and dignity. So I think dignity as something that people are offering is also problematic. And I mean, in my own work, I'm very much interested in the what is at stake in those kind of transactions, and redefine dignity, where you have people saying, okay, we need a prayer room because that's part of what we are, and we need to have decent places to pray, and we can't pray all together in the staircase or in the floor, as is the case over there, and whereas others would say, okay, we know how you should be here in Vincent. So yeah, I will leave it here. Just, this is a prospect for this old foyer when it is rebuilt. I also wanted to point to the idea of visibility and invisibility, because I think in the present context, the municipality of Paris are very eager to say that they are making a huge effort in maintaining migrants within Paris. Because of the high rates of the rents, Paris is an expensive city. So the idea that they are keeping them there, I mean, when I go to meetings, and it's not only public discourses, it's really what people are really working with in internal discussions. The term effort is something I can write down 10 times in our meeting. It's really what we are doing together. Even if not all the residents are taken back, there is also a process of triage. I can't enter into that, but it involves social workers and all kinds of institutions. But in the end, they are very eager to keep them there. I think they are, because they are visible, and it's very, you can't really see, but in those kind of images of the future of the foyer, you have, you have a man dressed traditionally, and he's alone, and they're discreet, and they don't make trouble. So I mean, this image of the resident of the foyer as a cool guy, but still testifying for the goodwill of diversity. It's something I think they are also cultivating. And so I'm very cautious about analysis in terms of invisibilization. I think they're playing around visibility.
Yes, that seems to be that actually visibilization, according to certain narratives which you thought is the case. And I would wonder, you know, also, I mean, you made a very interesting experiment here, actually, to try to get into a discussion, a conversation about what actually you should show and what for. But I mean, when you were talking with the people in the foyer, what were their hopes? What did they want to convey through this image? Except, I mean, it was interesting that one of the men wanted to convey that he prays. I mean, but beyond that occasion, I mean, what did they want to tell? I mean, because there is always, there is a skeptical issue about the need to show. There is this moral value to vision. But sometimes vision is exposure, sometimes it troubles you, and it's much more comfortable not to, or to have the power about what you saw, about yourself.
Some really took seriously the idea of memory work and said, we've been here for decades. That's another part of what I'm working in. They are really claiming to be part of the city. Often you have people from different communities, so when they struggle, they will not say, okay, we come from the same village. It's not the case. But they will say, okay, we've been together since the old foyer. We are the same since the 1960s. So I mean, they're really emphasizing this Parisian memory of their migration as really as urbanites. It's like as Parisians, and sometimes they will say, okay, we have developed France, so we should be allowed to be here. But the dominant discourse is about the city, sometimes the neighborhood. And in that line, some of them really think, okay, this is something we should document, the old foyer before it's destroyed. And we actually, we've taken the pictures back, but we're still thinking to develop a format for them, maybe a booklet or something to stay in the foyer at this moment. During the 2 years of rehabilitation work, they will be dispersed in very different places before many of them coming back. So there is also the issue of keeping this idea of one foyer alive throughout this time, this process. So some really went into that direction, but not all of them. Others were more responding in terms of, because for some I've been working for several years, so some really just wanted to do me a favor. So it's again a different kind of transaction.
I think this would be a very good moment for comments and questions from the audience before I make one.
Talking about the issue of making people of the foyer visible, and at the same time there was in France a very important issue also about the fact of making people from racial minorities visible. Do you saw a relation between the two issues? And the people you met make the relation between them?
The plan for rehabilitating the foyer is the municipality. It involves both people from the urban policies and from the DPV integration. So they do have they have some use of sociological knowledge, some political use of sociological knowledge, and some emphasis on diversity. This is something that is, but obviously it's, these kind of meetings with people from different backgrounds and institutions are also places of adjustments and struggles. So you may have some vision predominant at some times. But it is one of the components.
What are how the diversity and living together can be portrayed to the visual photography? And also, I just wonder, you said it's an all-male space. Is women allowed or not allowed to enter this space? And as a female researcher yourself, how is it work with this gender perspective?
In the foyer you have different waves of migrants. So mainly people from Algeria and North Africa in the 1950s, and then from the 1960s onwards from sub-Saharan Africa, but very dominantly because of French historic migration and because of local dynamics from specific communities around the Senegal River Valley. So you have foyers that are mixed in that you have people from different places. Those foyers are pretty much homogeneous with people from Schielke, Halpula origin. They are all Muslim. And in this foyer you have people from 3 Schielke villages in Mali and from a string of villages in the Senegal-Mauritanian border. So basically they are all Muslims or from Muslim background. But some foyers are more heterogeneous and you have less collective life. So sure, it's specific cases in these communities. As for the issue of women, in the old, because I didn't specify that the rehabilitation is not only about rebuilding, but changing the status from foyer de travailleurs migrants, so houses for workers, to residence sociale, social residences. And juridically it's not the same status. And the idea in the residence sociale is to mix people from different backgrounds, including homeless women, women with children, and so this is something they are resenting, because this is a way of diluting the foyer, so the residents are struggling against that, and so they have obtained a kind of intermediary status of résidence sociale, but former foyer travailleurs migrants, that's how they call it. So that's so they hope to keep it as their own space as much as they can, but obviously the new ways of granting rooms will change. The new rules will not make it easy to transmit one's own room to someone in the family. So it may change. As for the ethnographic relationship, and women do come in the foyer. In some foyers you have kitchen, restaurants with women. You have some visitors, women, all kinds of obviously social workers, activists. So it's not impossible to enter as a woman. Maybe it's more as going there in an all-male environment who may have find it strange, but I think for them it's not. In the end, we find. In my work, I always let people, if they are more comfortable, to meet me in a nearby cafe. I will go there. Some will introduce me in their rooms. Some will stay in collective spaces. So this sure is part of what I'm trying to reflect on, but it's not a big deal as such. In any case, you are a stranger and you are entering a space which is a living space. So to find your place is not easy. It is a tension between, so we don't see it as both places of discipline and control, neither can we take them as places where people spontaneously would come together. And I think where the cursor varies a lot across generations, age and occupation. So I think for some men who came in the 70s, some men have been working, at some point the foyer is really their home, and some couldn't have their family there, some choose not, and they often have a discourse on children being raised in Europe as an issue, of women claiming all sorts of rights, getting the children and putting them away. So that they are also very conservative places in a way, in the sense that people who don't want to live in the eye of the community would not stay there. So you have this kind of discourses where they emphasize their own choice. You have, especially for migrants coming more recently in a poor economic context, they have to rely on the others before they get a job, they get documents, and it's places where you can do that. You can have a free meal if you contribute to the work in the kitchen. And in that case, often it's more transition, and when they have documents or work and they can move out of the foyer, that's what they do. So, and I would also like to point to the fact that there are not only places of living, but also places where people would gather for the village-based associations, for instance, to have their meetings. If someone dies in France and they have to get the corpse back, they will have condolences there. So that they also have this function.
Okay. I think this is a very good moment to thank Aïssatou first of all, and to move to the next presentation.
I want to start by pointing out something that's fairly obvious, which is that in Europe, when we talk about migration, and African migration in particular, typically what people respond to is the idea of migration from Africa to Europe, so north-south migration. But self-evidently, there are many other types of African migration. For instance, there's migration from Europe to Africa, which is a phenomenon that's becoming increasingly common as women and men in the countries, notably of the European South, Portugal would be one example, that are in economic crisis, are turning towards the ex-colonies, which happen to be, so we are told, in economic boom times. That's of course a matter that we can debate to no end, but people returning, or turning themselves towards Mozambique, towards Angola, in an attempt to remake new lives. So this is one other type of African migration. There's of course migration from south to east, with a significant focus by men and women in Africa of looking to Asia, to China, to India, to Japan as loci for investment and also for places to study. And then there is, of course, south-south migration, which is a tremendously important phenomenon, and in the context of which intra-African migration is tremendously important. And it's on this, on intra-African migration, that I'd like to concentrate for the next 30 minutes or so, through the gaze of one particular artist with whom I've had the honor of collaborating since 2008, a man by the name of Mega Mingedi-Tunga, who is a multimedia artist from the central, central part of Congo, but who lives in Kinshasa, so from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I want to go back a little bit in time to 2008. It's May of that year, of 2008, and there is a wave of xenophobic violence that is sweeping over South Africa. Many of you will have heard of this. A week-long rampage leaves hundreds of dead and injured and tens of thousands homeless. Now, the violence is primarily one of poor South Africans against poorer Africans of northern origins, Zimbabwe, Malawi, etc. And it's made possible by municipal and police authorities that largely turn a blind eye to what's going on, or so it appears at first glance. I'm going to propose that we consider the timeline of this and this question of the blind eye. The violence, in fact, lasts much longer than just 1 week. As early as March of that particular year, there have been bursts of looting, of rape, of necklacings, of oustings directed at foreign Africans, or in any event, persons who are perceived as being foreign Africans. Lives are lost, bodies are trampled and raped, property is destroyed. The authorities, of course, know about this full well, and to a large extent, they fail to respond. At the heart of the matter, however, is not lack of response. The matter, the truth of it, is active involvement by the state in this kind of violence. For well over a decade at this point in 2008, so since 1992, 93, 94, the time when we consider that things are getting much better in South Africa, well, in fact, the government has actively been involved in removing very violently immigrants who have made their way from other African countries to South Africa. The violence has therefore deep and very widespread roots. It takes its roots in the apartheid period, and it is like a rhizomatic cancerous growth going to the very heart of the late capitalist world in which we live. So this is not at all a matter of aberration, as it's presented to be in some of the press, or a matter of some kind of simple, as it's also presented, simple matter of poverty breeding hatred. This, in fact, is systemic. This hell is structural. And therefore, it's going to continue. So let's move fast forward into 2009. Megamingedi Tunga, whom you see on the screen, the Kinshasa-based artist I was mentioning earlier, has just arrived in Johannesburg. He's in the city for a month for an artist's residency in which I also took part. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is something that I actually witnessed as it happened throughout the period of the residency. Now, Mingeti's work, to give you a little bit of background, focuses on issues of urban mobility. He's fascinated by cities as vectors of movement, physical and virtual. In highly complex 2- and 3-dimensional installations, experimental cartographies that he develops on paper and in 3-dimensional forms, he considers how networks of roads, of railways, of electrical cables, of radio waves, of internet waves, cross paths with the ways in which people move through space in order to construct cities that are radically unstable in the manner in which they function. To give you a little bit of a sense, here on the screen, a sketch for one of his installations, a piece from 2008, and here a piece that was first exhibited here in Germany in the context of an exhibition that some of you may have seen. It was titled Afropolis, that was shown in 2 cities in Germany. Mingedi is also fascinated by sports, by football, and by boxing, not for what they are, but for what they have to say about the interaction between sports and politics. And he's interested in the fundamental nature of the violence of sports. Now, just to give you a sense of this fascination, these are 2 details of very, very large cartographies of his, in which you see images of stadiums. Stadiums which happen to have played a critical role as sites of insane political violence during the Hutu era, which is also the era during which Mingedi came of age. So he has this fascination with the city as a space of movement and with sports and politics as spaces of violence. Now, given this dual interest in urban mobility and sports as politics, as soon as he hits the ground in Johannesburg in 2008, he's swept up in a maelstrom of activity and of ideas. Why is this? Well, it's because the World Cup is about to happen. It's going to happen a year from then, from June 11th to July 11th, 2010. So preparations are fast underway as he arrives, with the Johannesburg municipality hard at work preparing the city for its moment in the limelight. The residency in which Mingedi is involved takes place in an inner city Johannesburg neighborhood that's one of the toughest neighborhoods around. It's called Doornfontein. If there are any South Africans in the room, please forgive my pronunciation of it. It's not quite right. But I'm an American trying to speak something that's not mine. So this neighborhood, Doornfontein, and I'll be showing you some images of it shortly, the quarter is abuzz at this point with debate around how all of these municipal attempts to reshape the ways in which people move through the city is going to impact the neighborhood. And this is in particular because at the heart of the neighborhood, which you see at the center of the image here, is one of the city's largest taxi ranks. So there is a very strong economy here that deals with ways in which you move people from the center of the city to what used to be called townships, now have other names, but notably Soweto, right? And this economy is going to find itself very profoundly distressed by lines of buses and tramways, which the city is going to put in place in order to make the city look clean and organized for the World Cup. And this is something that's going to fascinate Mingeli. Now, his place of living during the residency overlooks this taxi rank, which is called Nur taxi rank, and which I'll come back to. He's at work in a building called the Drill Hall, which was once a prison and a military barracks, and then the site of a very famous set of trials, the treason trials, in which 156 anti-apartheid activists found themselves tried for treason, including Nelson Mandela. This happening, of course, in 1956 and 57, as most of you know. Now, my presentation this afternoon is going to center around an installation that Mega Mingeli created while he was in this particular space. And it's an installation that focuses on the matter with which I began, to wit, the structural violence that undergirds the kind of xenophobic hatred in urban South Africa and the intimate ties that this bears to anti-immigrant sentiment in cities worldwide. Now, this is a core issue for this neighborhood because, as I'll get into more detail with in a little while, this is a neighborhood of immigrants. Here in Doornfontein, in the neighboring quarter of Hillbrow, you have huge numbers of African immigrants coming from countries immediately to the north and who have made their way to this tremendously dangerous neighborhood. Now, what I'm going to be looking at in terms of the installation, in terms of what Mingeli did, is how it came into being, what it sought to address, and what it evoked and how. And then I'll go on to look at ways in which the installation does damage to. It actively hacks away at widely held perceptions of what a city should look like. Highly Eurocentric, and nonetheless late capitalist visions of what a city is supposed to be. And of course, you will see where I'm going given the context that we are with, what a city is supposed to look like absent its immigrant population. Now, a few days after moving into the Drill Hall, Mingeli began developing a very complex installation. And what this was supposed to be was a moving installation, of which you see a sketch here, involving rolling a gigantic football through the crowded streets of Doornfontein. And a key focus for him here was the fact that large numbers of the people who live in this neighborhood and who are mired in impossible traffic jams, which the Noord taxi rank is an intimate part of, right? That these people, because of who they were not going to be welcome at all at the wonderful celebrations of the Rainbow Nation. At Mingeli's hands, this incredibly disenfranchised neighborhood that is Doornfontein was about to be steamrolled by a Kinshasa and football-inspired take on the violence of movement curtailed. Very quickly, however, as he was planning this installation, two problems cropped up. First, given extremely limited means, there was the problem of figuring out how he was going to be able to make this huge ball that was going to be able to withstand the incredibly potholed streets of inner city Johannesburg. He didn't have the means to produce a ball that was tough enough to succeed in doing that. And here you see the artist actually at work trying to figure out how he's going to manage producing this ball. The second problem concerned the neighborhood itself, and this was a rather more complex question. Dornfontein, of which you see an image here, and I draw your attention to the buildings, which look, it's modernist architecture of the most inane kind, but you find when you look more closely at the windows that these modernist buildings are failing entirely to be what they're supposed to be. And these are very largely squatted buildings, and I'll come back to this issue of squatting in a second. So, some participants in this residency were absolutely fascinated by the fact that you had so many people of African origin, but coming from very different parts of the continent, all living together in this place. And they were fascinated by the babble of different languages and different ways of seeing, doing, different kinds of dressing, and so on. This seemed very exotic to a lot of the participants, a number of whom happened to be European and North American. Mingeri, however, is not at all fascinated by what he sees. He's shocked. He's profoundly dispirited by the dire poverty that he encounters in the neighborhood, by the constant fear that he witnesses among Dornfontein's immigrant poor, fear of being booted out of the rundown buildings that they're squatting, fear of the police, fear of gangs, fear of the xenophobia that has the country by the throat. He's appalled by the ruined dreams that he encounters every single time he walks out into Dornfontein. He is absolutely not amused by this vision of exotica that many of the participants have in the process. What he sees in this and in this, which is a view basically out of the window where he's living, what he sees is a repetition of what he's seen before elsewhere. In the hell that Kinshasa became in the late 1990s at the fall of the Mobutu regime, when huge numbers of people migrated to the city from the surrounding areas in an attempt to find some kind of solidity, some kind of life, and arrived in a city where no one wanted to hear that they existed. This is what he sees. And he is also reminded of the tremendous violence that's visited on African immigrant bodies in Europe. The ugly world of constant ID checks, which you see here, of course, holding cells and baton-wielding military police that so many Africans encounter when they arrive in Europe. This is what Dornfontein reminds him of. The worst for him is the sight of the hundreds upon hundreds of Zimbabwean refugees who are adrift in Dornfontein at the time and in the nearby neighborhood of Hillbrow. The poorest of the poor. This is a photograph taken by an artist for an NGO that works with Zimbabweans who are living in the inner city. Now this is emphatically not what Mingeri had in mind when he arrived a few days earlier at Oliver R. Tambo International Airport, which is quite the gleaming kind of centerpiece. To mull all of this over, Mingeri takes to his room, and he's going to disappear for 2 to 3 days. And finally, he exits his room, and he says, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I am not going to leave my room. I refuse to set foot in Dornfontein. I'm just not going to move. What I'm going to do is this. He says, for many who have been thrown out on the streets, who have been removed from their squats, public space in Dornfontein has become a space of wrecked lives, of wrecked private lives. There are no more private lives. In response, what I'm going to do, he tells us, is I'm going to seek to explode the notion of private space. And I'm going to turn it into a radical reincarnation of public interaction. Watch me turn private space into public space by refusing to engage with public space. What he ends up doing is completely bizarre and absolutely fascinating. First, he puts up a sign on the door of his room. It's a multilingual sign, and in it he identifies himself, the occupant, in Lingala, in French, in assorted broken versions of the 11 official languages of South Africa, he identifies himself as a Zimbabwean in Johannesburg. The white-on-black sign that he produces, and which you see on the screen, looks more like a wanted poster than anything else, and that's, of course, what he needs to do. Then he gets to work, and he invites anybody who wants to come in to visit and see what it is that he's doing. Shortly, however, getting into his room gets very complicated. It gets complicated because Mingeri, it turns out, is building that huge football that he planned to roll through the streets. He's building it in his room. And it reaches the floor to ceiling, leaving only a narrow space along the sides. This is a huge contraption. Now, I'll get to showing you photographs in just a second. And he produces a kind of minimal gallery around it. A gallery that has a cartography of various cities collaged into one another. Johannesburg into Kinshasa, notably, the two fused into one another, so that there's no way to tell where one begins and the other ends, which is a point I'll return to later. In the first days, or rather in the first nights, because Mingeri likes to work at night, during the first night, then it's fairly easy to get into the building, into his room, because he's actually constructing just the armature of the bulb out of plastic tubing that houses electrical cords. But then, things get more complicated as the armature becomes larger and larger. Entering and exiting becomes even more complicated when he starts covering the ball in cardboard, and you can't actually step through the ball anymore. And providing that you're small enough, you can see the mural that's emerging along the edges of the ball, and you find that this mural is changing absolutely every day because he's keeping himself very much in touch with what is going on in the outside world. And this is something that you see because he's covering the ball in newsprint. So he's very much aware. He's not exiting the building. He's not exiting his room. He's sleeping there. He's having food brought to him there. He's drinking there. He only goes out to go to the toilet about once or twice a day. And the rest of the time, he's finding out what's going on in the world. And he's very much aware of what's going on in the city, but completely enclosed in his private space. So public and private space are becoming extensions of one another in a really peculiar and very interesting way. The result, by the time he's done building this, the result is completely psychedelic. You can't get into the room. You can only get into the room through the window, which is, of course, a reference to squatting, right? So he's got huge lines of people trying to enter through the window, which is not an easy thing to do in the drill hall. So there you have it. More images of the ball. And you have this line of bottles of cheap whiskey and beer lining the entire room, glinting from light that's coming out of the only window, which provides a kind of scansion for the eye, because you have a lot of trouble actually focusing on any one thing that's happening in the room, because it is the sense of implied movement in this structure, in this ball. You have visual stimuli constantly bouncing off of you. And so these bottles give you a sort of calming effect as you watch this extraordinary thing grow. By the time the ball is finished, you can really barely make your way into the room. The room puts you in mind, and this is something that's really quite interesting, it puts you in mind of the indoor spaces that Eyal Weizmann talks about, for those of you who have read his book on the Israeli occupation, Hollow Land, Israel's Architecture of Occupation. It puts you in mind of that because you have a private space that has been completely exploded, made into something public, to a large extent, against the will of the squatter that he has constructed himself as. And this is all the more interesting. This is just an image of the ball to give you a sense of This is particularly interesting because at the time, the neighborhood is being scoured by these people, the Red Ants. The Red Ants, who are vigilante groups organized by the state in order to remove in great violence the Zimbabwean squatters who are trying to live in the neighborhood while the state is trying to clean up the neighborhood for the World Cup. And so this notion of a private space exploded into a public space is absolutely fundamental to both what is going on inside Mingedi's head, inside the room that he has created, and outside in the squatter camps that exist all around the space that he is living in. We can talk further about the analogy that I'm building with the Jan Weizmann and with the Israeli occupation, which is, of course, not an idea that I'm proposing. It's an idea that Mingedi has brought up himself in our discussions. 5 minutes, okay. So, something that goes on here with this ball in the room. And here you see very specific references to the red ants. You can see, I hope that the lights are dim enough that you can see the red on the mural, which is a reference to the red ants. What you have here is a rather extraordinary thing that's going on. In one of the most implausible and uncannily one of the most logical mixes imaginable, the spirits of French playwright Eugène Ionesco, to your left, and Cameroonian filmmaker Jean-Pierre Bécolo, about whom we were speaking yesterday in our conversation, they've managed to meet up in the drill hall around a question that's absolutely fundamental to Mingedi's work and to the exhibition that you've seen here, which is the question of invisibility. Ionesco is present via his very famous play, Amédée ou comment s'en débarrasser, Amédée ou how to get rid of it. And Bécolo by his best film ever, which is called Les Saignantes, in English, The Bloodettes. In the Ionesco play, it's a body that will just not stop swelling, taking up more and more space. You see, of course, the foot of the body appearing on the right. And in Bécolo's film, it is the body of a John, of a prostitute's client, that has been cut into small pieces by the prostitutes on whose watch John happened to die, but that keeps on showing up in the most absurd places in the city. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, in both Bécolo's film and in Amédée ou comment s'en débarrasser, in both instances, this corpse that will not disappear is the proverbial elephant in the middle of the room. It's the thing taking over that no one will acknowledge, the thing that is rendered invisible despite the fact that it is absolutely fundamental to what's going on. In the confines of Mingedi's room, turned public viewing chamber, the thing is not literally or even symbolically a corpse, but it does lend itself to a reading as a deceased entity. The entity is two things simultaneously. First, it's the immigrant, it's the foreign body, and everything associated with it. The flesh and the lives of the human beings, or the flotsam and the jetsam of the system that wants only to see them disappear, to erase them from the face of the city. But second, this deceased entity, arguably, this is a conversation I've had back and forth with Mingedi quite a bit, this deceased entity is the city itself, the modernist city. The city that keeps on insisting that it will exist clean and pure of its migrants, of its poor, whom it renders invisible. And this city, which exists only in the imagination of a late capitalist system that's incapable of recognizing the condition of its own demise, or indeed its active participation in its own demise. And it is to this second death, in many senses, that Mingedi's work of art, that his installation is dedicated. If I have about 3 more minutes, am I okay with that? For some years now, scholars in a range of fields have been arguing that canonical approaches to urban space fall short when applied to cities like Kinshasa, Mingedi's home city. Despite claims to universal applicability, such approaches tend to be, of course, terribly Eurocentric and also terribly dated. They're rooted in the modernist project, and for this reason they favor teleological narratives of progress, linear narratives of progress, in which, of course, the ultimate is the European city, the modernist city, the perfectly clean city of the type of building I showed you before, a city where there are no squatters. At their core, the core of these images is a reliance on dichotomies, center versus periphery, formal versus informal, success versus failure, that cannot account at all for diversity, for ways of experiencing and structuring and imagining urban life beyond the confines of very narrow visions of what a city should be. And such either-or readings of urban space have a pernicious, a very dangerous effect. They're not just a matter of theory. At the hands of the World Bank, at the hands of all kinds of NGOs, at the kinds of municipalities such as the one of Johannesburg during the World Cup, they produce disasters. They render invisible huge categories of the population. Examples of this abound, and Johannesburg during the World Cup is ultimately the great example of that, with all kinds of hotels and stadiums and parks created, all of which are spaces from which the migrant body must be rendered invisible, must be removed, if the modernist city is going to continue to function as it is supposed to. Now, lest, of course, one conclude that such exercises in failure are a matter of so-called developing world only, one need only look to Paris and to what Aïssatou was telling us just a minute ago about how authority would like to present itself and to contain the migrant body, the image of the migrant and what the migrant can say. The immigrant Mingedi is telling us is not going anywhere. He's actually in the room, back to that huge ball that is the elephant in the room. He's in the room. The title of his piece is Lelo Awa, Here Today. The immigrant is in the room, at the center of space, a kind of planet that he's created inside this room with distinctions between cities, Johannesburg and Kinshasa, which, as I told you in the mural, become one, become extensions of each other. But also all kinds of other cities that show up in his mural, New York, Mumbai, Paris, all of which he references by way of different buildings. All of this notion that there are distinct cities and borders between which the migrant body cannot work and move. He explodes all of this in this particular installation and tells us this notion of the modernist city means nothing. In a post-colonial, late capitalist world wherein borders for all of the walls and all of the prisons and all of the camps and all of the graveyards that are built systematically fail to staunch the flow of human beings produced by the very system that would hold them in their place. This is the message of Nega Mingedi's Lelo Awa. It's once a dirge, a funeral song for the countless Zimbabweans who were hunted down across the world's cities, and it's a massive middle finger, a massive fuck you, raised to the same world and to the lullaby of uncontaminated cities that it persists in singing, the better to sleep as it heads straight for the wall. Thank you.
I wonder about, I have two questions. One is, was the ball ever taken out? And is it only possible to basically, do you have to basically destruct it to actually take it out? And the other is, you said that he was stuck in the room, yet kept learning about the world through newspapers, but of course he's learning about the world while avoiding the world and only learning through the world, which is usually controlled by anyone other than migrants. So I think that is a very interesting way of learning about the world, and I wonder if he himself commented about this choice and what he said.
And it was actually really interesting because you had all of these museum curators who were showing up and you said, you've got to protect the ball. And he kept on saying, no, the whole point is you've got to destroy the ball. So it went back and forth like that. And you can see that we were all desperately trying to photograph the ball to have some kind of archive of it. So, these, incidentally, I should say, are not my photographs. My photographs are not remotely as good as these. These are by the two organizers of the residency, Jean-Christophe Lantin and François Duconseil, who organized this day. The question of what he knew of the outside world is actually, I should have been more detailed about that. One of the things that's really interesting about the mural is that it includes all kinds of references to what the other artists in the residency were doing. There were about 30 of us there. So what that means is that he was actually talking to a lot of people as well. He wasn't just getting his information from newspapers, he was also very much discussing with people what was going on. And there was one artist in particular, who was a Cameroonian artist by the name of Hervé Yamgen, who was one of the people who was really excited by the neighborhood and was bringing a lot of the bottles actually back to Mingeri, because he was spending most of his time in bars meeting people. And they had a lot of discussions about what was actually going on in the city. And it's a very good point that you raised, because when you compare what appears on the ball to what appears in the mural in terms of representations of the city and of the world, you get two completely clashing readings of what was going on. And I don't actually think that this was something that was necessarily perfectly clear in Mingeri's head. I think that he really wanted to show the sort of explosion of data, and that's part of the image that we did.
It's interesting because you were talking about another artist or another creative individual. What were you yourself doing in that moment? What was your main focus?
I met the people who run the residency. It's part of a sort of collective of residencies that have happened, well, you know this, in various cities across the world. And I had met them because I went to one of the cities that they had worked in after they had done the residency with Hervé Yamgen, the artist I just mentioned. And I wrote a piece about the traces of their residency, and they thought that that might make something interesting. So they invited me to Johannesburg to do the same thing.
So you basically sort of like investigated on the different studios and the different artists.
Exactly.
Interesting.
I was the local scribe.
So we should invite you often then to know about all the others then.
I'd be delighted to. Thank you. It's great to see you.
Later. I'll track you down later.
Good.
Others?
I needed to use a brutal terminology because
So, to warm up the discussion, I have a question of my own, which was that issue of the public and private. Because, of course, it is, I mean, conceptually it's a fascinating thing, and there is a very interesting work here in this exhibition that is called Yacine's Voices, where the speaker is Yacine, an Algerian living in Marseille. And at the end he talks about actually his encounter with the artist in the third person, as for her it's a project, but for me this is my life, and problematizes the whole idea of telling. And I mean, as an artist, you make yourself visible. That is the whole job. But I was wondering, how does this relate to the other issue of if you live in a squat and then somebody comes to photograph you for an NGO? It is a very different kind of breaking into somebody's privacy or turning somebody's privacy public. Conceptually it has the same gesture, but it really doesn't feel the same.
No, it doesn't feel the same at all. It was an interesting problem for me as I was preparing for this talk, because I was trying to figure out what is appropriate to show of the lives of Zimbabwean squatters in Johannesburg, there's a huge archive of photography of the violence, of the xenophobic violence in 2008. It's all over the web. And it was a very serious question for me to figure out what was I willing to show. I mean, most of you here are very much aware of the debate around showing photography of violence or not showing photography of violence. To be perfectly clear, I come out very strongly on the side of you show it. You deal with the violence of the imagery. But since I was dealing with issues of private and public, I felt that I couldn't do it. That there were images I couldn't show. And I was very much struck when, Aïssatou, when you were talking about aestheticizing the foyer, the extent to which this photograph of the Zimbabweans is an aesthetic image. I mean, if you look, I'll go back to it. I can find it. I mean, the focus on it, you don't see it as well as I do on my computer screen, but the focus on the greens and the mix of the blues and on the making of something that is in final analysis very aesthetic in all of its misery is I think a very serious problem that I hadn't quite looked at when I chose this image as in many ways the least innocuous of the ones that I could have chosen. So I think that this question that you ask is fundamental because I think Mingeli's piece works precisely because it refuses to engage with the actual body of the migrant. Because it refuses to put itself in a position of making the body of the migrant into art. And I think that that's very specifically intended on his part. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Sometimes I feel that the most consequent reaction to these iconographies with their other problem is to produce no images, to avoid them. But obviously this doesn't work because there is a demand, there is a need, and there is also a political use for iconographies, for images. You have to, just because there are powerful images, you need to have powerful images to counter them. You have to need powerful narratives to counter them. So this is, I think, in a way, a very fascinating case of trying to actually create such an image, which also avoids that kind of reproduction of the migrant's body. But this is, of course, something that, how could this kind of an approach be generalized? How can we take something that, sorry, I never get the word right, Mingeti, or something like Anissa and Aïssatou have been addressing, something that Charlotte Menin tries with her work with Yacine. How can we take this into something that can also move beyond the exhibition space to have public impact? Because this is always a question of impact as well.
I actually, I mean, it's a question I ask myself in sort of a larger context. And I must admit that I have a pessimistic answer to that, which is that it's tremendously difficult to counter the kinds of images that one wants to counter when you look at the juggernaut that you're dealing with, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, the various newspapers. It's tremendously difficult to counter what is presented without amping up, without, in other words, showing, you're going to show me this, I'm going to show you what it really looks like. And therefore turning to a use of violent imagery that poses tremendous problems. It's my goal to try to defend this kind of alternative representation, but there are days when I have serious doubts about whether it can have a form outside of the exhibition space.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dominique. Thank you very much, Aïssatou, thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you for the audience and the organizers of this event. And it's not over yet, drinks are waiting there, so we can continue the conversation in a more informal manner. Thank you very much.